If you hold the purse strings to government spending, there are so many things that will suck up those dollars. You could pour trillions into the health system, billions into education, or spend between 44 and 54 billion on building 17 roads.
These are the highways that will make a real difference in people's lives. It is a huge investment in New Zealand's future, and we make no apology for doing so.
Last week, an update on progress, including news of a $5 billion cost blowout covering just a handful of those roads, and some details on spending.
We're also announcing combined funding of nearly $1.2 billion to move these roads to the next stage of development. There's $675 million to progress consenting, design, route protection, site investigations and some early works. You can't just turn up and build a road tomorrow. Actually, it takes some time. Designations and consenting, route protection, site investigations are all a really important part of that.
If 8 of these roads have had their costs increased by $5 billion in the past 2 years without any shovels even getting into the ground, what does that mean about how much we think they'll actually cost by the time they're done?
Basically, it's just picking a number and multiplying it by the time the roads are finished.
The problem is it's just extraordinarily expensive to build, and we have to be smarter about how we build our infrastructure in New Zealand.
It is an awful lot of money.
The bottom line is that we need to act now to future-proof this country's infrastructure.
Kia ora, I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, the big 4-laned highways that the government is calling roads of national significance. Are they worth the money?
It'll be a big shock to a lot of people, but roads are a needed part of our infrastructure.
That's Infrastructure New Zealand's Chief Executive Nick Leggett. We'll get to him in a bit. But first, Newsroom senior political reporter Marc Daalder has been looking at the numbers.
I found a few things. For starters, we now have a sense of the total cost of the Road of National Significance programme because some of the roads that had been proposed hadn't received costings before. And it looks for these 17 roads, like the government currently estimates that they'll cost between $44 and $54 billion to build. So for context, that's 23 times the cost of the Dunedin Hospital rebuild that the government has landed on the cost for that one. NZTA estimates the total cost of the entire highway system, 11,000 kilometres of it, is about $80 billion. So this would be half again for just 17 roads. And the other thing that we've seen is for some of these roads that had been costed before, their costs had been included in National's campaign policy documents before the 2023 election, and NZTA had done some reworkings of those costs after the election as well in preparation for the new government. Those costs have increased in the couple of years since then. For just 8 of these roads, they now cost a collective $5 billion more to build than they were expected to just 2 years ago.
And what is the driving factor? I mean, is the cost of asphalt doubled, or are we talking about planning? Are we talking about subsequent slips and workarounds?
Yeah, I think there's a range of factors, and it's sometimes a bit of a case-by-case basis. For some of these projects, the scope of them has expanded or changed, so they're going to look different than they had previously thought. Some of the costings, certainly that National relied on during the campaign, were really old costings, some of them dating back as far as 2015. So we've obviously had quite a lot of inflation since then, increases in the cost of construction materials, supply chain troubles and so on that have driven those prices up. And that we know, it's getting more expensive to build things even just over the past few years in New Zealand. And yeah, that time has passed since the costings were developed, and that a more intensive process has been undertaken to understand how much these projects might cost. And as a result of that, we've gotten some higher figures than we had expected.
Is there one project that's sucking up all the billions?
There's one project that's sucking up many of the billions, which is the Northland Corridor, which kind of has 3 parts to it. There's the Warkworth to Wellsford bit, there's the alternative to the Brinderwinds, and then there is Whangarei to Port Marsden. That collectively will cost between $18 billion and $22 billion. And so that's a very significant portion of the portfolio, but there are still another 14 roads in there, besides those 3 that make up the rest. And basically all of them now are expected to cost $1 billion or more.
Northland, I feel, has done its time waiting for its roads to be fixed. I mean, is there a case for them to say it's time we got this part of the country moving?
That Northern Expressway has got to be ready to go. You cannot have a donkey track into Northland as a region, can you?
Oh, the Northland Expressway is in procurement right now. So stage 1, Warkworth to Wellsford, that's in procurement right now. We're expecting to turn a sod on that next year.
The question is, what do you consider makes the economic case for a road? There are lots of ways to look at that, right? So NZTA has done some benefit cost analyses, and they make these ratios that says if you have a ratio above 1, then it means the benefit is going to be greater than $1 for every $1 of cost that you invest in building the road. And that's a bigger benefit to society. It takes into account how much faster it might be to go somewhere. It takes into account, all the economic boosts from having new roads built for the construction jobs, but also the regions that are now connected better together, etc., etc. For that Northland corridor, they say that it will make it about 38 minutes faster to drive between Te Hana and Whangarei.
Now, that figure struck me as dodgy, given the entire 76-kilometre trip, according to Google Maps, takes a tick under an hour. The Northern Advocate questioned NZTA about it and discovered there should have been a whopping great asterisk against that time. The 38-minute saving was calculated for bumper-to-bumper traffic. Without holiday traffic conditions, the time saving is as little as 8 minutes. There are other benefits, however.
The safety improvements to the roads will reduce deaths and serious injuries by 66%. And so now they expect it will save or earn society $1.40 for every dollar invested into it, which is positive in terms of you not spending more on it than you're getting out of it. But it's not a huge benefit in the big picture. So that's not to say it shouldn't be done, but governments have priorities. If we had unlimited cash, we'd invested in all the things that make sense, but $18 billion can buy a lot of things, and it may be that this is the right decision for that, but it is a decision to make.
How accurate are the cost-benefit ratios? I mean, it seems to me, A, they've been tweaked, and B, they're sort of fairly subjective about what they consider to be a benefit or even quantifying that benefit.
Yeah, so you're right. The way in which they've been calculated has been changed. So Treasury has introduced new guidance to NZTA and others around infrastructure investment to say, consider the benefits over a 60-year time frame instead of a 30-year time frame, and use a lower discount rate, which basically means accounting for, the changing value of money now versus in the future. Using a lower discount rate makes those benefits look better. Probably without those changes that have been recently introduced, you would see that most of the benefit cost ratios on these projects would be negative. You'd be losing more than you're getting, which is traditionally what has happened with some of the roads of national significance and other big roading projects in New Zealand. That doesn't mean that the change is inherently suspect. People have long argued that infrastructure should be considered differently because it is a long-term investment and it will be around for a long time. It should be treated differently than a particular business investment or building a couple of houses or something like that. And so that's part of what's gone into that change. Chris Bishop, the Minister for Infrastructure and Minister for Transport, said, he doesn't take a huge stock in the benefit cost ratios on their own. He made the point that the Northern Busway in Auckland had a BCR, a benefit cost ratio of 1.2, which is even lower than the Northland Corridor, but it's been a very important, part of the city's economic story in recent years. It's hard to imagine Auckland without the Northern Busway. It's probably saved many billions of dollars, extended the life of the Harbour Bridge. So it's not perfect, right? It's not an exact science. You're still making estimates about what you think will happen in the future. The flip side of it is the Greater Auckland blog. They write a lot about transport and infrastructure. They estimated that if the people using the Northland Corridor, if the number of people using it doubled over the next 30 years, it would still be working out to about $70 per trip in terms of the total costs there versus how many people are actually using that road. That seems quite high.
Okay, let's talk to the author of that blog, Greater Auckland Director Matt Lowrie. He's written that the cost justification for building these roads has been juiced by some convenient maths, with changes in the benefit-cost ratio calculation issued by Treasury earlier this year.
What effectively the government have done through officials is to change those rates to be more favourable to big projects. So they've lengthened the period of assessment over time, and they have lowered the discount rate. So it's, instead of paying, previously it was about 30 years at a 6% discount rate, and now it's more like 60 years at a 2% discount rate, and even lower for the last half of that. So that means that these big projects suddenly look a lot better, and the government have stood up saying, that they've said the benefit cost ratio is only one aspect, and that's correct. It is only one aspect that goes into the assessment, but they're also saying that these make good economic sense. But under previous scenarios, these projects would never have been built based on the economic outcomes. And you think quite a bit about the discussions a decade or so ago with the City Rail link in Auckland, where that used those old assumptions. It's sort of scrapped by, under these new assumptions, it would look far better. We'd be having a far different conversation if we were looking at the kind of benefits that it's producing, or it will produce under these kinds of calculations, I guess. And so the criteria has effectively been lowered quite significantly to make these projects stack up.
I mean, if we were starting to build the City Rail link now, it would cost an awful lot more than it has done, even though
it would absolutely, yeah,
mind-boggling. So is there an argument to put shovels in the ground, just to start doing some of this infrastructure that we do really need, a lot of it?
Yeah, I think there's actually, first of all, we have a question of why these projects have become so expensive. And you look at something like the East-West Link, which is one of these roads of national significance, is a really clear example where less than a decade ago it was costed at about $1.8 billion. That was at the time considered the most expensive one of the most expensive transport projects in the world, or road projects in the world. It was compared to a very famous corruption-ridden road in Russia by one of the infrastructure lobbies we have here. It was far more expensive than that. So that project has been scaled back into a more sensible solution, but it's more than twice the price of what it was less than a decade ago. If we look at most of the sort of expressway type projects like the Northern Corridor that were built in the last 20 years, or prior to about COVID, they would generally cost in the range of $30 to $70 million per kilometre. The upper end is obviously quite a bit more than that lower end, but that's the sort of range. Whereas we're now looking at projects, most of these are in the 100 to 300 million per kilometre. So our costs have gone up astronomically for building these kinds of projects. And before we start saying we should just get on and build them, we probably need to have a question of, why have these costs gone up so much? What's changed that means that we're having to pay so much more to deliver the same infrastructure? If we could maintain the sort of costs we had in the past, which we maintained for relatively for 20 years, these projects would cost about $10 billion to deliver versus approaching $50 billion that we're seeing now.
The counter-argument to this is that we underestimate the benefits from such infrastructure. Nick Leggett from Infrastructure New Zealand says the parameters of the BCR can be quite narrow.
We need to find a new way of looking at these projects so we can evaluate them. But I'll give you an example. Auckland Harbour Bridge, when it was conceived and proposed to central government prior to its construction, they said, no, it's too expensive. The benefit cost ratio is only 1.5. So Auckland said, well, actually, we believe in this project, so we're going to go out and find the money and build it ourselves, and we're going to toll it. If you just relied on benefit cost ratio, you might have gone, oh, is it worth it? But it led to the whole North Shore. 5% of New Zealand's economy travels across that bridge every day. And if it fails, and there is a risk of it failing at some point, it's not going to go on forever, it would be catastrophic for Auckland and for wider New Zealand. So I think benefit cost ratio is narrow. There are externalities for all of these projects that we should also consider, and maybe that's slightly outside of what NZTA does, and I accept that, but there has to be a broader picture built on the back of large, expensive infrastructure projects in this country. We should be thinking more about the whole of life cost of these investments. We tend to think too much of the upfront capital cost, and then you get people come out, as they have in a chorus with these roads of national significance and say they're too expensive. The upfront capital cost is too expensive, where we don't consider benefits well enough. We don't consider the whole of life cost of an asset well enough. And so we're not getting the total picture. Recently, Infrastructure New Zealand commissioned Infometrics to do some work on Transmission Gully, the Kapiti Expressway and Peka Peka to Otaki. And we are, 3 years after Transmission Gully opening and all three roads now functioning, what the benefits are, what are the economic benefits and the social benefits. And that the zero deaths, massively reduced serious injuries, and an estimated $173 million a year economic benefit to reducing people sitting in traffic. Now, that's one lot of benefits, but we did that very deliberately because New Zealand doesn't, as well as not considering the whole of life cost of an asset, we tend to just build things by the way and then forget about them and don't maintain them properly, and that's part of the problem. But we also don't paint a picture of what we're trying to achieve, but also really understanding and being able to explain what an individual investment in a piece of infrastructure is going to do for a community, for business, for the environment, for the economy. Where are we building to? What are we trying to become? How are we going to grow our wealth as a nation, because we are slipping behind at the moment, that can afford to pay for not just more infrastructure, but more resilient, adaptive infrastructure, this kind of public services and health and education, supporting an ageing population. We can only afford to support those if we are growing as an economy, and infrastructure is the backbone of that. We don't think about those things. We don't think long term about what are we buying here. And politics has crowded this decision making.
Do we need, though, for example, 4 lanes up to Northland, which doesn't take, in the grand scheme of things, a great deal of traffic comparatively? Or are we looking at things like, Northland's particularly affected by slips and weather? How do you see that project, which is sucking up a huge percentage of this money?
I think that we have to look at Northland not in isolation, but as a supporting PO of Auckland, just as we need to look at Tauranga, the Bay of Plenty, and Hamilton and the Waikato. And if you look at nations that do well, they invest in infrastructure before it's needed, and they grow and they prosper as a result of that. New Zealand has got too much into the reactive catch-up. And so I do think that Northland very genuinely has a case, a resilience case, a case of being better connected, a case of offering resilience for port and freight, for tourism. And yes, it is very expensive, but it's not just Whangarei, it's all those communities between the North Shore and Whangarei that will ultimately prosper. It's a massive growth corridor for New Zealand. And a road needs to be supported by really good spatial planning, which is on its way. We're hopeful in the RMA reforms. So we can start painting that much more vivid picture of what infrastructure can deliver around it, what it can enable to happen in terms of new homes, new businesses, and ultimately a more functional economy that can deliver for more people. We've got to get better at explaining that and preparing for it and planning, but ultimately taking the nation on the ride, because if people can't see benefits, if they're not explained, they won't buy into it. And all they'll see is the cost. And that is I think there is a cultural aspect to this in New Zealand. We do whinge about the cost of everything, and we see the value maybe 10 years later once something's built. But we have to better imagine, and not just imagine, but ensure that when a project gets built, we extract the value that communities would expect.
Is spending $44 to $54 billion on 17 roads the best way to develop infrastructure in New Zealand? Is it the best use of our money?
I don't think we can adequately answer that because we don't know what the options are. What's the opportunity cost? What else could we invest in? Have we built out that picture in a way that communities, business, iwi, politicians can weigh up the pros and cons of different investment decisions? It is an awful lot of money. I would be of the view that we absolutely need to continue to invest in new expressways that connect communities, that are safer, that are more resilient to weather events and natural disasters. Whether we can afford this, whether it fits within a long-term, because it is a long-term picture, whether it fits within that long-term picture, whether it will survive different governments is the question.
Transport Minister Chris Bishop understands this plan needs to transcend political changeovers.
It is important we have a clear plan for delivery, including well-reasoned prioritisation to inform the order with which these roads will be funded and ultimately delivered. And we'll have more to say about that in coming months.
One thing that, the Infrastructure Minister, Chris Bishop, said to me that they've been very clear that this is a long-term pipeline. They're not building all 17 of these roads tomorrow. I asked him, would we get to the 2040s and they still haven't started some of them? And he said he doesn't want to put a specific date on them, but that later this year, the government will be making some announcements about how they plan to stage and prioritize these roads. In other words, in many electorates that have been promised a new road, who knows when that will actually get started? He says he's been clear that that's the case, that it is a long-term picture, that once you finish one road, you don't want all your construction workers to pack up, the firms to fold, the equipment to be shipped overseas. You want to have another project ready to go, and so that's part of the theory behind this. I don't know that that's necessarily the message that voters have been hearing when MPs from government parties go out to their electorates and say, look, we've got the approval for this new road. There's not an asterisk on there that points to some fine print that says, but it might not get started until 2035, and potentially maybe there should be.
Marc Daalder says everyone agrees that we do want an infrastructure pipeline.
Maybe the question is, what should be in that infrastructure pipeline? Should it be mostly roads? There's a chart making the rounds, I think it's from the Infrastructure Commission, which shows that the vast majority of infrastructure spending over the next decade is going to be in transport. We talk about and think about energy, and I've spoken on the detail before around investment in solar farms, wind farms, offshore wind, all that sort of stuff. It's going to be totally dwarfed by the investment in transport. The total investment over the next, in the infrastructure pipeline, it's projects that have been announced, they might not even actually happen, for energy is about $11 billion. These 17 roads, again, are going to be at least 4 times that. So, yes, you do want a pipeline, and each individual project stacks up based on the benefit-cost ratios that have been provided by the government, but we only have so much money. And so the question that should be asked is this the right priority for us when we're thinking about infrastructure? Should it be transport first, followed a little bit by water infrastructure, and a little bit of energy infrastructure, and everything else kind of bits and pieces of gets the crumbs of what's left over?
That's it for today. The Detail is a Newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Jeremy Ansell and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Marc Daalder, Nick Leggett and Matt Lowrie. I'm Alexia Russell. Safe driving.